used athletes under certain conditions, which I'll talk through. So this is one of their kind of position papers. This is the one in the States, which obviously has like the most litigious kind of culture in the world. So you're nailing colours to the mast. You've better put out a statement saying it's safe for kids. So all those, by the way, all the links are there. So if you want to go back through, once John sends up the slides, you can pull out those position papers and have a read for yourself. But they're all there, and they all kind of agree it's the same thing. So it seems there's a bit of confusion around what the term stunting of growth actually means. So, for example, the stunting of localized growth versus a limiting of my finalized adult stature. So, for example, if I fracture my wrist falling off my skateboard, and I fracture my scaphoid and injure the growth plate there, that's not going to stop me being 6'5". I was never going to be 6'5" in the first place, but that's not going to limit my adult stature. But there seems to be this idea that it's one and the same. The actual mechanism of fracturing or causing a stunting of growth revolves around these kind of red bands. So these are what we call fallacies or physis, which is basically around the ends of bones, you have these growth plates. In order to damage growth plate, you basically have to fracture one of these, cause damage to one of these. So the mechanism is a trauma to one of these growth plates. So that's your femur, that's the bit sticking in your hip socket, that's the bit that's on top of your knee. Injure one of those, you potentially could harm the growth rate of that particular area of the bone. Now, remember we talked about peak height velocity and how we go through those periods of rapid growth. Well, we know that these sort of injuries are particularly kind of susceptible during those periods of rapid growth. So when bones are changing length, when we're kind of undergoing real rapid maturation, there's a potential for injury in that scenario. Now, 15% of all fractures that happen in childhood are these type of fractures to various areas of the body, so they're affecting growth plates. Now, some of the most common causes: falling from a bike, from a skateboard, or out of a tree, in one of the studies I pulled out. Another one, this is American, so ice hockey, American football and baseball accounted for 33.5% of that 15%, if you like, so not 33.5% of all fractures, just of the 15% were fallacies fractures. Skiing, biking, skateboarding, popping up again, 21.7%, that was in the same study, so 33.5% added plus the 21, you're covering most, just over half of your fractures. The biggest kind of cause was contact sport, particularly American football. That was the most reported. Now, if you take your pads off, American football, you speed it up a bit so you don't rest every 3 seconds, and you force them to pass backwards, you pretty much have the sport of rugby, because you have people running into each other. So what we're looking at here, really, is we're talking about impact, aren't we? We're talking about impact onto concrete or a road, off a tree, into other human beings. We're talking about big impact trauma collisions. That's what we're talking about. It seems to be the primary cause of these types of injuries. So, based off that, I want you to have a little look at these clips and decide which one you think is potentially more traumatic to these kind of growth plates. So this first one, just got a girl squatting. So, I mean, you could argue there's some supervision because someone's videoing her, but there's no real kind of coaching going on. You can hear some kids in the background. That total weight she has on there is probably about 10 kilos. So you're looking at a training bar, which is 7 kilos, 2.5 either side, so we'll say it's 9.5, 10 kilos. Now, if I'm coaching her, I can control the load on that bar. I can take it off, I can add more. I can slow her down, control the speed of it. I can stop other people from running into it. So that's fairly controlled. I can control the speed of the force, total load on. I can control some of the technique, etc. The title kind of gives this one away, but have a look at this. Watch it in slow motion, see what works. What are your thoughts on that? Do you know the craziest part? He doesn't even get tackled by the biggest kid on the pitch. He's actually lucky. He gets tackled by the second biggest kid. But this is what we would kind of constitute a level playing field. Now, if we think back to what we spoke about skeletal age and biological age, it's clearly not. but under the rules of rugby, essentially that is legal and fair. And there was nothing, okay, you could argue maybe the kid missed time his tackles a little bit higher, etc. But actually, it's within the rules. For the most part, it's within the context of club rugby. They're all the same age, in inverted commas, so it's okay, right? And in contact sport, injuries are just part of the game, isn't it? Well, hopefully we're starting to challenge that perception. Actually, it shouldn't necessarily be. Because if someone came out of a gym session with me and had fractured their wrist, the parent would want to know what the hell happened. But if I said, oh, we did a contact rugby session, oh, it happens. Yeah, it's the same injury. So how is it that one's okay and one's not? So actually in that second one, I can't control the speed of any other players on the pitch. I can't control the weight of any other players on the pitch. I can't control at what point they're going to make contact. So actually, my rationale would be in that first flip, I have far more control over the training space, the application of force, the rate of that force, the speed of that force, than I do in that second situation. And yet the second situation is a cultural norm, the first is not. So again, we can mediate any risks from a strength program with those same three factors: appropriate plans, appropriate coaching, appropriate supervision. This is a big one for me. Because you often see these articles of like 13-year-old boy killed bench pressing on his own. Like, in my opinion, if you put 10 13-year-old boys in a room for an hour, come back an hour later and expect them all to be alive, you're an idiot. Yeah, I've seen 13-year-old boys, and I definitely wouldn't leave them alone with bars and weights in for an hour. So, it's just insane. You wouldn't do that in any other context. If you did that in a school for an hour, you'd be hungry on the corner. So I don't know why people think it's okay in a gym scenario. It's simply not. So that appropriate supervision is a big thing. So all those agencies that we spoke about before, the UKSCA, BASES, NSCA, those are the kind of caveats they put in place. They say it's safe if you do those three things, which makes sense. It's logical. So in reality, weight training doesn't actually stunt growth. It could actually do the opposite. So if you think about bone tissue actually requires stress for adaptation. So I don't know if you know much about space. My girlfriend's a big space nerd. I did a study in a master's on compression suits, which basically help athletes astronauts stay compressed. But astronauts have real issues with bone tissue. So when you send people up into space and there's zero gravity, what happens is your skeleton starts to basically become pretty brittle. So they've had to come up with ways of being able to exercise without gravity in space. Because I can't squat, I can't bench, I can't do all those things to load my bones, because gravity isn't there. So they come up with things like the K-box, things like resistance bands, etc. And it's a fundamental part of their training while they are up there in space. Because if they don't come back to Earth with a certain level of bone mass, they're in real trouble. And you see when they come off space shuttles, they then do 6 months of bed rest. Because the gravity on Earth is just too much for them. And that's even with these training protocols in place. So actually, if you do the opposite, so if we completely unload people, it's not good for them. Just as much as we overload people, it's not good for them. We have to find this happy medium. So bone tissue requires stress for adaptation. There's a couple of studies here that back that up. So in this particular study, they took youth weightlifters, did a DEXA scan of them, which is bone mineral density, got some kids the same age as them, did a DEXA scan. Youth weightlifters had higher levels of bone mineral density. Okay, fine. They went and compared that to adults. They still had high levels of bone mineral density. So actually, the bones of those youth weightlifters were adapting and creating greater levels of bone mineral density than their kind of peers, if you like, who weren't training, and then even adults. So there's a big kind of stimulus there for bone growth. The other element is that weight bearing has been suggested to be even more important than calcium intake in predicting bone mineral density. So actually, we make a big song and dance about calcium intake in kids and strong bones. Actually, weight bearing, so exercising involving gravity, involving load, can be even more important than that. And not just bone mineral density at childhood, but bone mineral density at adulthood. So we're talking about long-term effects now beyond sport. So this is a quote lifted straight out of Strength and Conditioning for Youth Athletes by Dr. Roger Lloyd and Dr. John Oliver, who are probably the leaders in the UK in terms of the research in this area. And now if you look at those research statements earlier, they're on that along with Avery Fagenbaum, who I think was in one of yours or possibly David's lecture as well. So actually, you're getting the same kind of people agreeing on things. They basically said that it's the complete opposite. So contrary to the misconceptions, research suggests childhood to adolescence is in fact the most opportune time for bones to respond to the compressive tensile forces experienced during weight-bearing exercise. So instead of avoiding it, actually we should embrace it because it's beneficial. Little schematic here kind of explains that. So this is the idea of the changes that go through your bone mass during the life cycle. So during your early growth phase, you're basically laying it down, laying it down, laying it down. Once we reach adulthood, we've reached our peak. From there, it's a one-way street. So what we can do here is help promote the laying down of bone mineral density, because essentially, once we get our peak, we're never going to get any more. We're only going to get less. Can anyone think of one particular population that would benefit more from anyone else on that?
The older population. Older population.
All the population? Any particular?
Older.
Older? Okay. What happens before people get old? Sort of our age?
Osteoporosis as a result of menopause in women is a significant area where you need to improve bone density.
100%. So why don't we, before we get older women with osteoporosis, why don't we grab younger women and get them weight training? It's essentially what this says.
The Osteoporosis Association of Ireland has been promoting recently the best time to start strength training for girls is prior to puberty.
Yeah, makes perfect sense.
For osteoporosis.
And if you think culturally speaking, actually, it's only until recently that tide's turned. You know, Olympic lifting wasn't even in the Olympics pre-2000 as a female. It's only recently that, you know, strong is the new skinny. You know, there's been the idea that actually women lifting weights is beneficial, and this kind of movement away from this kind of tiny Kate Moss stick thin kind of woman to actually a woman who's strong and powerful and athletic, which is brilliant from a cultural perspective, because actually it feeds into this. If we've got girls who are weight bearing and lifting weight, we're actually looking at long-term health effects, not just when they're adult, but into old age. So we can help prevent that long-term osteoporosis. Does that make sense? So another myth is this one: children should only do trunk training and core training because they don't benefit from strength. Research has suggested this is a fallacy. So again, this is another one from Jan Moore, another infographic. What he's done here is taken 43 different studies, condensed the findings down into one, and said, what do all these things have in common? So the first one is that resistance training programs positively improve strength, linear sprint agility, vertical jump performance, and sport-specific performance. So if I could give your athletes all these benefits, why wouldn't you take them? You wouldn't go, no thanks, we'll just do core training because they can't benefit from that. Actually they can, so why don't we access those benefits? Second, I don't know the mechanism behind that finding, but they suggested that girls had a greater training-related sport-specific performance gain. Interesting finding. Resistance training programs with free weights were more effective for increasing strength. And then essentially resistance training programs improve measures in muscle strength if you do these kind of parameters. So they're long-term. It's not a 6-week program, which is often what you see in research. We did this 10-week program on beginners. Brilliant. I'll throw that one in the bin because anything makes a beginner better. What can you do in the long term? And if you look at the loads they use, like 80 to 89% of 1RM, that's heavy. Yeah, that is heavy. So they're looking at actually high loading, they're looking at multiple sets over the long term, 6 to 8 reps, so kind of the strength hypertrophy area to that. Yeah, John?
Yeah, I just had one point too, because it's actually quite a poignant point that, you know, from our perspective, having worked with lots of athletes now in Jersey over the last 10 years, you tend to see girls, particularly young girls when they come in, they're so far away from the genetic potential of strength, where boys when they come in will have done something. So I can understand there being a higher performance-related outcome from doing resistance work, just because simple transfer, because they're further away from genetic potential from it.
I guess if you think of cultural norms, the fact that young boys are more interested in strength training, maybe they've made some of those adaptations already, whereas maybe the girls, if they're starting from zero,
Exactly.
it's believable. So yeah, essentially there's benefits on the tables if you want them. If you actually are going to be super conservative and say, no, we'll just do planks, we'll just do crunches, fine, but be aware that you're leaving all this on the table and that someone else somewhere is doing that. This one's probably the most important one for me, which is how young is too young to start training? And if you ask Rodri Lloyd that question, he would say, if you're old enough to play the sport, you're old enough to train for the sport, which makes perfect sense for me, because then you're actually prepared. Essentially what this is saying, it's fairly complicated, but we'll jump down. If you start strength conditioning or physical preparation exercises during pre-adolescence, you have an advantage over people who did it during adolescence. You also have an advantage over people who just play sport on its own, and over people who do nothing. Makes sense, doesn't it? From a physical literacy standpoint, actually, if you're engaging in multiple activities of running, jumping, landing, hinging, squatting, pressing, pulling, you're going to have an advantage of people who don't do that. But the earlier you start that kind of activity, potentially you could improve performance over the long term. And that's from, again, you'll see there's Rodri Lloyd there, there's Avery Fagan-Barnes, the same guys we talked about earlier, and Greg Myers, who's also very heavily involved in this scene. So when they class training, they're looking at resistance training, dynamic stability exercises, core training, plyometric drills, agility training, so a multifaceted kind of strength and conditioning program. And we can see that that again has gains into adolescence and into adulthood. So essentially, this comes down, in my mind, to training age. Yeah, and you see this when I have an athlete who's got a training age of say 3 years, so they've already been doing stuff for 3 or 4 years. Obviously, they're going to be more advanced than the little Jimmy who just walks in the door then. Makes perfect sense. By the way, gymnastics. That's what I'm going to say. Gymnastics is this big time. Every time I get an athlete who has done gymnastics, sometimes athletics in their background, you can tell